Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, November 2nd, 2020, and today's episode, in my humble opinion, is really one of the most important messages that I have to share at any time. It's really a combination of a lot of the stuff that I've said here on this show and with the organization over the years. But the timing, of course, is really important. So I'm going to point out three ways that I see the federal government based in Washington, D.C. It's not really a federal government. It's an imperial empire more than anything. It doesn't act like federal, and the states don't act like states anymore. But I'm going to point out three ways that the feds are the most powerful government on Earth and potentially in the history of the world. And then I'm going to go all the way back from 1765 through the ratification debates and share a very consistent viewpoint and attitude of how to deal with unconstitutional acts that violate your rights. Then I've got Thomas Jefferson on how to deal with unconstitutional federal programs, federal acts. 4 steps to stop federal programs from James Madison himself. And then 2 huge challenges based on a quote from the late, great Samuel Adams for the future of liberty. 2 huge challenges. So I'm going to mix in some stuff from Patrick Henry, John Hancock, James Iredell, Theophilus Parsons, maybe somebody else too. But first of all, before getting to all that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program, and we're slowly and steadily improving that page so you can find more episodes on specific topics that are interesting to you. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. At the top, you're going to see a featured episode on the 10th Amendment itself. And then we've got all the platforms, both video and audio, so places like Periscope, DLive, Library, LBRY, Library.tv, YouTube, Facebook, all those. And then we also have the audio-only podcast editions on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Podbean, and elsewhere. And then as you scroll down that page, you can see not only the most recent episodes, but then I've got certain sections like the Federal Reserve, the Supreme Court, nullification principles, the nullification movement, the right to keep and bear arms. And I'm going to keep adding more and more sections as I go through some of the old episodes and try to categorize these a little bit better for you. And you can even find our membership program where you can support us for as little as $2 a month, and that goes a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Thank you so much for any consideration you can give to that. The show homepage, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out, and that's where you're going to find for this episode and every other episode. I'm going to include reference links where you can read what I'm talking about on the show in context, in full, and you can do research on your own time. So a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat before we get to this. Pro-life, pro-liberty in Austin, Texas. Tim Martin in windy, warm Casa Grande, Arizona. Alabama, Dixie Strong, Funky Euphemism, Tyler B., always good to see you. Clay Kent, Neil in Pennsylvania. Ooh, that's an interesting place to be these days, isn't it? MRGF 78. Dan Reed, good to see you, buddy. Patricia Dance up in Syracuse. Setuni says, happy Monday, WC in, I think you're in Ohio, right, WC? Good to see you. Clay Kent, I like the phrase Imperial Empire. Scott Dybus over in Tucson. We got a lot of supporters in Arizona, Texas, and here in California as well, kind of a 10th Amendment state. If you'd be, well, I don't know if any place really is. But anyways, I apologize if I missed anyone here in the shout-outs, but I want to make sure everyone has a chance to say a quick hello, a chance to get notifications from whatever platform they're watching on live. But let's get to this. Also hello to E.H., Neil, and Kyle. Kyle over on Periscope. Thanks for checking us out there. And now a quick introduction to this. And I think I should start off with a prediction, since everybody else is prognosticating what's going to happen. And this is one that I've made every round of these things since I copied it from Harry Browne, the late, great libertarian author and Harry Browne, amazing writer. So no matter who ends up in charge in Washington, D.C., in 4 years, the federal government will still be the largest government in the history of the world. It will be the largest government on the planet today, and will probably be far bigger, more powerful, and more in debt than it is today. And I think we could end the show with that, because that tells you so much of well, what most people do to solve their problems is they go to the federal government in the hopes that federal politicians or federal judges or federal bureaucrats are going to solve the problems that were given to us by the largest, most powerful imperial government in the history of the world. And that is just a bad strategy. And I know you've heard this many, many times from me, especially if you listen to the show more recently. But I want to go to an article or a blog that we posted just late last week by Mike Meharry titled "The Biggest, Most Powerful Government in the History of the World." Let me pull this up here on the screen so you guys can see it as well. And he says, you know, you often hear Bolden and I talk about this. We're going to say this over and over and over. But, you know, does that sound like hyperbole? And Mike actually dug in on some of the numbers. And I know I've covered a little bit on this show some of the statistics on spending, for example. But he has some other interesting points that I fully agree with on how the U.S. government, based in Washington, D.C., that's supposed to be limited, charged to only limited delegated powers under the Constitution, is somehow enforcing its will over the entire globe. And here's a few ways that they do that. And of course, I will mention spending. The SWIFT system, Mike writes. SWIFT is a very important thing to know about. It enables financial institutions to send and receive information about financial transactions in a secure, standardized environment. Since the U.S. dollar, that fiat funny money garbage that they convince us all to use, since it serves as that was my aside, Mike did not put that in his professional quality blog here. Since the dollar serves as the world reserve currency, Mike writes, SWIFT facilitates the international dollar system. So if all countries on Earth are really participating in this SWIFT system, and the SWIFT system, there's some control, well, it's not direct control, but there's pressure put by the U.S. government on this so-called independent organization that actually facilitates transfers, then it gives a serious problem and serious power to that government in Washington, D.C. And Mike puts it this way. He says that gives the U.S. the ability to effectively cut other countries off from the global economy. And the U.S. has used this power to bend countries such as China, Russia, and Iran to its foreign policy will. They literally can just say, like, look, you're going to do this, or maybe we're going to ask SWIFT to enforce these policies that will say that, well, now there's sanctions from the U.S. government, so now you can't have any transactions. We see some countries out there, for example, starting to, for foreign trade, starting to authorize cryptocurrency because the feds can't stop that. Well, certain ones. Mike goes on, he says, you could argue that the British Empire or the Roman Empire wielded similar power, and I think you could. But neither of those mega governments had nuclear weapons and the ability to literally destroy the globe. The power of the United States government is arguably unmatched in human history. So we've got the SWIFT system where they control the financial transactions of the entire globe. Not completely. It's not a monopoly. I know a lot of people like to use the term monopoly for large influence corporations when it's not really a full monopoly or an actual monopoly or a natural one or a government-enforced one, for example. But government certainly is a monopoly, and the U.S. government has near monopoly control over international financial transactions through SWIFT. And then they also have enough firepower to destroy the globe many, many times over, more so than anyone in history. And of course, we have the spending issue, one that I've talked about quite a bit. He says, and Mike says, even if the relative power of the U.S. government compared to past regimes is debatable, the size of the U.S. government through spending is not. One metric, he writes, we can use to compare the relative size of governments is expenditures. Based on IMF data, the U.S. government spent $7.66 trillion in 2019. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the ratification debates? Thomas Jefferson, after he came into office, people like James Aird, even Hamilton, the idea that the federal government would run up these types of debts, these types of budgets and spending amounts, and they would have approved that instead of what they had under the British Empire, not a chance. It just would not have been approved at all. Now, Mike points out that the next closest country in expenditures, in outlays, is 4.14. A little bit more than half. I'm not really good at math because I went to government-run schools and everything they taught me was garbage. Or they weren't even good at teaching me the basics. But so China is number 2, $4.14 trillion compared to the U.S., $7.66. And we know that China has way more people. Mike says the disparity in the scope of government becomes even more apparent when you compare the two countries' per capita spending. There are countries that do way more, small countries that do way more per capita. But the U.S. spent $20,674 per capita in 2017, and China was $2,700. So almost 9 times. Oh, 8 times. In other words, there's my government school math. In other words, the United States, Mike writes, the limited constitutional government spends nearly 8 times per capita than China's socialist state under the People's Democratic Dictatorship. The socialist state under the People's Democratic Dictatorship, I believe, does come, that is, he put that in quotes, I believe it comes directly from their constitution or a description of their constitutional official. So it is a socialist state that the U.S. government spends almost 8 times the amount. You cannot defeat socialism by supporting people who run a government that spend this much money, more than the biggest socialist state on earth. It's not even close. The biggest socialist state on earth really is the United States government. It may just not be socialist in ways that some people on the right or the left think it counts as socialist, but this is incredibly, incredibly massive. Now, we can compare that, just to reiterate, compare that with what James Madison told us the federal government would have power to do. On Federalist 45, he put it this way: the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. Instead, we have it the other way around. The federal government has numerous and indefinite power. It has numerous and indefinite spending capability. Its debt is like beyond fathomable. Its reach through gun control and surveillance, spending, the SWIFT system, military might, and all of this, it is totally unthinkable in relationship to what the founders and ratifiers gave us in the Constitution for the United States. So obviously, with a government of this size, something has to be done about it. And most people say that there are just 3 things that should be done: vote the bums out, sue in court, and march on D.C. And that's how most people treat a strategy to undermine and defeat one single federal program, all of them, whatever. Now compare that with what Thomas Jefferson had to say, and I've covered this quite a bit lately, but I think it is important to reiterate over and over and over again. Jefferson here in his draft of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, this was around October 4th or so, he put this to paper. And this is an important distinction. I've got 2 short quotes that I think will hopefully make a lot of sense here. He says, in cases of an abuse of the delegated powers, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, a change by the people would be the constitutional remedy. But where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Let me just paraphrase this, sum it up. When they just misuse the powers that have been delegated to them, they've done too much regulation of commerce. Maybe they declared war, even though it's authorized to Congress, they declared war in a situation where you don't think they should have. Things like that. If they abuse the powers that have been delegated to them, or they use them improperly or in ways that you think are bad, then you vote the bums out. That's the strategy. But whenever they're assuming powers that are not delegated to them, and if we're talking about a government of this size, and the reason I wanted to start out talking about the size and scope of the government, it is not only telling you and I what type of plant we can have, whether or not we can defend ourselves, and how big our toilets can be. It's told us what type of light bulbs we can have, whatever. It is involved in nearly every facet of our lives in some way, either on its own or through pressure, through tax stealing, and then using that taxation, those theft funds, to pressure state and local governments to bend to its will, on and on and on and on. But there is no way to look at what it does today and see it as just an abuse of the delegated powers of the Constitution. And therefore, almost everything that they're doing is a violation of that original Constitution. And so, according to Jefferson, every single situation like that, it's not about just choosing Team A or choosing Team B or going to the federal courts to solve federal problems, to asking federal politicians to limit their own power. begging federal government to stop doing what it's been doing to us all along? No, he says a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. It's a line in the sand. Jefferson wasn't coming up with something new, and I think we've actually done a poor job years ago of pointing out that Jefferson and Madison really just kind of established this principle, but they were just building on a long tradition that it was widely understood that this is how you deal with governments that violate the line in the sand. They cross the line in the sand and start doing stuff that they're not supposed to do. Now, under the British unwritten Constitution, that was just more widely understood. It wasn't put down on paper, and that's part of what drove them to put a constitution, first the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution for the United States. Of course, all the state constitutions as well. That's why they had those constitutions, so they could have a different approach. They knew that this unwritten constitution didn't give them the paperwork, the documentation of the boundary, and government would always violate it. Now, we know that they violate words on paper as well, and we cannot rely on words on paper to enforce themselves, but that's another episode. So let's go back all the way to 1765. This is, again, Jefferson was reiterating a widely understood principle, and I think much of it came from Patrick Henry. But where did Patrick Henry get it? I've covered this in a standalone episode on May 29th, May 30th. May 29th was Henry's 29th birthday, 11 days after he was first sworn into the House in Virginia. In response to the Stamp Act, he introduced a series of resolutions, most of which passed, some which did not, but they were all widely published, and it became part of the philosophical basis for resistance. Let me just read 3 of them for you. And they sound very similar to what Jefferson talked about, just in older language. So he says, resolve that His Majesty's liege people of this, his most ancient colony, have enjoyed the right being thus governed by their own assembly. That's the line in the sand. It's like delegated and reserved powers. We are governed by our own assembly, and when the far-off government tries to do stuff, it's not supposed to. You're just supposed to leave it be. And what they had done was basically just trusted that that tradition would hold, and instead it did not. And then so the young, fiery Henry came in and said, like, look, this is a problem. So we've always had it like this. We've governed ourselves on our own local internal things. He says, in the article of taxes and internal police. So in the police powers is basically everything. It's not foreign commerce, it's not war, but it's all the day-to-day things. That's what Madison was talking about in Federalist 45. The powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined, those reserved to the states. The police powers is what it's called in law. Those were numerous and indefinite. And Patrick Henry was talking about the same thing regarding Great Britain. He says, we are governed by our own assembly in the article of taxes and internal police, and that the same have never been forfeited. We've always held this, or any other way yielded up, but have been constantly recognized by the kings and people of Great Britain. So they had been lucky up to that point in many ways that this line in the sand was recognized. So he goes on, resolve, therefore, that the General Assembly of this colony, together with His Majesty or his substitute, have in their representative capacity the only exclusive right and power to levy taxes and impositions on the inhabitants of this colony, and every attempt to do so, to vest such power in any person or person whatsoever other than the General Assembly of that colony, is illegal, unconstitutional, and unjust. So again, this is like a precursor to the structure of the Constitution, the structure that was reiterated by the rule of construction, the rule of legal construction, that is the 9th and 10th Amendment, that the powers delegated are very specific and everything else is kept back. And anything that is done outside of those powers are unconstitutional. And the people of each state or each colony can call them that. That's what Patrick Henry is doing even before there was a written constitution, all the way back in 1765. May 29th and May 30th of 1765. So not only are they not authorized to do these things, we're calling it unconstitutional, and then he follows up with another resolution. He says this, His Majesty's liege people, the inhabitants of this colony, are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance whatsoever designed to impose any taxation whatsoever upon them other than the laws and ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid. That is really a nullification. That's what Jefferson referred to as nullification. We are not going to participate in this. We are going to do what we can to render this ineffectual, because the only ones we are bound to obey are the ones that are in line with the Constitution. And when that far-off government today it's the federal government in Washington, D.C. does stuff it's not supposed to do. It is the line in the sand that you've crossed, and we will not participate in that. So that's a very early precursor. We also have, in response to the Stamp Act, just a couple of weeks before it was going to go into effect, John Hancock said one of my favorite quotes ever to his London agent, Jonathan Bernard, basically summing up the mentality of the people of the time. He said specifically, the people of this country will never be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. That was the mentality of the people all the way back in the 1760s. They weren't talking about separation at the time. Maybe there were some hints, but they were already saying, like, look, you are only authorized to do what you can do, and if you go beyond that, we're going to take action. We are not going to submit to this. And that's what John Adams, even the late, he turned into a monarchist at some point. John Adams, early on, when he was really, really good here in December 20th, 1765, he put it this way. It sounds like Jefferson and Madison in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. He says, the Stamp Act, I take it, is utterly void and of no binding force upon us, for it is against our rights as men and our privileges as Englishmen. So an act, he says, an act which rips up the foundation of the British Constitution and makes void maxims of 1800 years standing. So it's void. It is not saying, we hope you will call it void. We're going to go to your courts in the hopes that your courts will call it void. No, we are taking the position that it is void in and of itself, and we are not bound to obey it at all. We are not bound. There's no binding force. We are not bound to yield obedience to it. He goes further. He says, the Stamp Act was made where we are in no sense represented. Therefore, no more binding upon us than an act which should oblige us to destroy 1/2 our species. Again, not binding. It's the same attitude. Going further, here is the Declaration and Resolves, 1774, the First Continental Congress. Their first resolve, the people are entitled to life, liberty, and property, and they never ceded to any sovereign power whatever, a right to dispose of either without their consent. So in other words, here's a line in the sand. You're not allowed to violate our life or liberty unless we approve of it. Number 10, their 10th resolution in that. It is indispensably necessary to good government and rendered essential by the English Constitution that the constituent branches of the legislature be independent of each other. 1774, no written constitution, still considering themselves subjects of the king. He says, therefore, the exercise of legislative power in several colonies by a council appointed during pleasure by the crown is unconstitutional, dangerous, and destructive to the freedom of American legislation. And in resolve, they resolved to say, to these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit. Again, that's that mentality of you're only authorized to do these things. When you violate it, we will not and cannot submit to them. This is an ongoing viewpoint all throughout the years, the multiple decades that led up to the time before the Constitution was even under consideration. Here is Theophilus Parsons in the Massachusetts ratifying convention in early 1788. Again, taking the same mentality. Jefferson didn't create this. Madison didn't create this. This was a well-understood approach. When they exercise powers not delegated to them, not authorized to them, then the people should resist it. And that's what Parsons said, too. The people themselves have it in their power effectually to resist usurpation. Usurpation, you know, is when government exercises powers not delegated to it. That is a theft of power from the sovereign people of the several states. He says they have an ability to resist it without being driven to an appeal to arms. An act of usurpation, he says, is not obligatory. It is not law. And any man may be justified in his resistance. And of course, he went on to talk a little bit about jury nullification. But again, it's resistance. As soon as they do stuff that they're not authorized to do, anyone is justified. That doesn't mean it's always good strategy to do that, but you have a moral justification to resist. And here's James Iredell, who was appointed to the Supreme Court by George Washington. He was, like, I believe, the third seat on the original Supreme Court, the first Supreme Court. And he says, abuse may happen in any government. This is in the North Carolina ratifying convention in the summer of 1788. He says, the only resource against usurpation, the only resource, not, again, this is, you see the difference between a misuse or an abuse of the delegated powers versus what do you do when they usurp powers, when they take powers and exercise powers that they shouldn't have in the first place. There's two different strategies because they're two different beasts that you're dealing with. And he says, Iredell, one of the first Supreme Court justices, the only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. They don't have to have it written down in a document. They don't have to have a license or a permission slip from government. They don't have to appeal to the federal courts in the hopes that the federal courts will say, yeah, you don't have to obey this now. No, it's an inherent right to prevent its exercise. He says this is the case in all free governments in the world. The people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it. He should have said the people should resist, but I think he really believed in the people of the time. Of course, they had just come out of decades of resistance, so maybe he had hoped that that's how things would play out, or maybe he was only thinking short term at the time. Of course, it hasn't gone that way since. So those are some of many, many examples of this very consistent attitude that there is a certain line in the sand where the far-off government can only do so much stuff, and anything beyond that should be resisted and disobeyed at every single turn. And that brings me to James Madison. Writing in Federalist 46, he provided us a 4-step strategy to bring down federal programs, whether they're unpopular or unconstitutional. And I'm just going to read through this. Should an unwarrantable measure of the federal government be unpopular in particular states, which would seldom fail to be the case, or even a warrantable measure be so, which may sometimes be the case, the means of opposition to it are powerful and at hand. The disquietude of the people, their repugnance and perhaps refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, the frowns of the executive magistracy of the state, the embarrassment created by legislative devices, which would often be added on such occasions, would oppose in any state, a single state, very serious impediments. And where the sentiments of several adjoining states happen to be in union, would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. In other words, short version, Madison gave us 4 things that the people in the states could do to deal with federal programs, whether they thought they were just bad policy or unconstitutional. And it would be very difficult for the feds to overcome this in one state, and almost impossible to deal with if multiple states took that approach. This is the father of the Constitution, so-called father of the Constitution, telling us how to deal with federal programs. Now, again, disquietude of the people. He expected the people, I'm just going to go through these. Disquietude of the people. The people should throw a fit, a hissy fit, every time the feds usurp power. They should be out in the streets. We are seeing more and more protesting. It has limited effect, but it's an important part of the overall puzzle. Number 2 is repugnance and refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Now, the #1 dictionary of the time defined the word repugnance as disobedient, not obsequious. So if you want to stop the federal government, you have to disobey them. Madison also told us that the people would directly refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. Of course, if we talked about legislative devices, the states can also refuse to participate in the enforcement of federal programs. We need governors that are supposed to be talking out against the federal government, not just acting as what they do. All 50 governors are absolute garbage. There is not one. You may find that most of them, you'll find each one doing maybe one thing on this. But don't be confused when a politician, especially one with that much money and power and influence at any level, when a politician is in line with you on one issue, even if they're great on this issue, that one issue, they are very likely horrible on almost all the other ones. So unfortunately, we're missing number 3 by far. And number 4 is the legislative devices. So these are the 4 steps that James Madison advised on how to deal with the feds. Now, one thing that's really important to notice, and I covered this in an article a few years ago, I wrote, what's important to note here are some glaring admissions. The powerful means that Madison told us would be used to oppose federal power successfully did not include federal lawsuits in federal courts, and he also did not include voting the PUMs out as a strategy. That doesn't mean that you're not supposed to use those strategies. He just said, like, look, if you're worried about the feds encroaching on the power of the people of the several states, here's how you do it. And he did not include those 2 steps as how to be effective. Now, you can, like Jefferson told us, in abuses of the delegated powers, that can be a very good strategy. Unfortunately, we are so far beyond that that it is almost worthless to spend any time on it, in my view. Going further, again, a reminder, one more time, in cases of an abuse of the delegated powers, Thomas Jefferson told us, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, a change by the people, is the constitutional remedy. But when they exercise powers outside of the Constitution, outside of the compact, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. And people who don't want to take this approach because it seems too difficult, too scary. I mean, what is more difficult than going to the largest government on Earth in the history of the planet in hoping that putting new people in charge of all that power are somehow going to just say, all this power you've given me, no worries, we won't use it anymore. I'll do everything I can to get rid of it. You hear every single round of this, every single season of this, we hear, oh, so-and-so is going to be less bad than this person, and this person is going to be less bad than this person. This person is going to be good on this issue at least, and none of them are ever good on anything, to be honest with you, because the size and scope of that government keeps getting bigger in the big picture. And even if they do one small thing, again, they may do one small thing in one area, but in general, it's just total, utter garbage. Now, James Otis, back in I think this was 1763, maybe 1767, he reiterated this type of mentality, this idea that when they do stuff that they're not supposed to do, there has to be resistance to it. You can't just beg and hope that government is going to stop. You have to have something that will keep them in check. And he put it this way: there is nothing, however, will in the end more surely work the destruction of liberty than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. The most dangerous thing to liberty is to have the attitude that it is always better to just tamely submit, according to James Otis. And of course, we have to have a change from the attitude that happens right now. The attitude that most of the country, millions and millions and millions of people, have the attitude of, well, I'm going to do my duty. I'm going to support this person with money every couple of years, and then I'm going to go back to having brunch. Not pay attention, not take any action. I'm going to just post some cat memes, whatever it may be, and I'm not going to take action. But there has to be a lot of action. And John Adams talked about this in February of 1818 in a letter to Hezekiah Niles. And he said this: "But what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The Revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in the religious sentiments of their duties and obligations." So he was talking about how the American Revolution wasn't just a war. The revolution happened before the war even started. It was the reason that the war even happened, the separation, the secession from the empire even happened, the reason that there was a Declaration of Independence was because people had a different approach over the years leading up to it of their duties. Now, was it their duty to obey the government in all cases whatsoever? Or was it, as Patrick Henry and John Adams and John Hancock and many others argued, that, well, we'll obey on these things, but as soon as you cross that line in the sand, we have no obligation to submit to this. And that's how Adams summed it up. He says, this radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affection of the people was the real American Revolution. Now, this last quote here from Samuel Adams, writing as Candidus in the Boston Gazette in 1771, I think this points out two very, very, two very important and difficult issues that we have to deal with going forward. Two big challenges for the cause of liberty, for the Constitution, and he summed it up this way: the truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. So not only do we have a serious education problem, people don't understand that liberty, that freedom is a good thing. They think that every solution, every problem requires a government solution. That when there is a problem with delivering health insurance to people, you need a government mandate to force everyone to get it. Not thinking the other direction, maybe the government is too involved, let's get rid of it. There's always a government solution to every problem. And those government solutions at best are band-aids, but in general, they make things worse. They cost more than they should, than the market would price them at. And they also violate liberty over and over. And therefore, they're only implemented through taxation, which is own problem right from the start. Again, the truth is all might be free if they valued freedom, so that's part one, and then defended it as they ought. Now, defending freedom, resisting usurpation of power doesn't mean begging the people who've been violating the power, violating your rights, usurping power to stop doing it. There is an actual defense, a resistance that has to happen. We know what that resistance is according to Patrick Henry, according to John Adams, to Samuel Adams, to Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and so many others. And only when the people learn how to exercise their rights, whether the government gives them permission to or not, will the government ever be held in more check than it is today. Otherwise, as long as people keep this mentality of being law-abiding citizens, there's no reason for them to stop passing new laws. Because once you get a new law, there may be some opposition to it at first, but once it's entrenched, then, well, that's the law, and I want to be a law-abiding citizen. And eventually, there's no reason for them to stop. And that's how I think things are right now. So two major things that we have: education problems, because we've all gone to government school. I keep talking about it. I learned to worship government. Government was going to fix everything. Government is the good guy. But we don't value freedom if we're always going to government. We don't defend freedom if we go to the violator of our rights in the hopes that they're going to stop doing what they've been doing all along. Anyways, I hope this makes a lot of sense. I hope it has some impact. I think it's an incredibly important message. It's one that I will repeat in many different ways over and over and over throughout the years. It's something that I've talked about, and hopefully this combination at this time was interesting to you. Just reading through some of the live chat. Patricia Dance's cat memes. I love cats. So cat and bird memes. Funky Euphemism says, it's not that people go back to doing nothing and not caring. They need someone who will tell them what to do. They elect people who will tell them what to do. Yes, indeed. Certainly they want some strong overlord, whether it's the right or the left. They want their side to have power to tell everybody else what to do, and they're already on board with whatever messages. They just want force. Now, there is a very popular meme, internet meme on the left, like, oh man, if things go a certain way, I'll be so glad and I'll just be eating brunch. In other words, I don't have to pay attention because so-and-so's in power. This is putting faith and trust in your rulers, and maybe that ties in with what you're talking about there as well. Clay Kent says, folks, we are there again. To quote Thunderclap Newman, something is in the air. Clay also says the government can't find its way out of a paper bag, or if it does, it just costs $1 trillion, I guess. It just would spend so much money. Bob Brewer says, isn't action participating in meetings of your most local elected bodies? Fix yourself, fix your family, fix your country, state, nation, world. I think that's a very good approach. If you're going to be involved politically, of course, we're talking about nullification, we're talking about resistance. You can have far more effect, far more impact if you can get your county, your local town, your city, your state to stop participating in the enforcement, implementation, or effectuation of whatever particular federal act is important to you. I would recommend start out with one at a time and build from there. We've got to set this foundation and get the ball rolling, but absolutely, Bob, I'm on board with that as well. DL Neal says, governments have only two tools at their disposal, taxation and legislation. They're always, of course, enforced with the barrel of a gun. Both are restrictive in nature. Neither creates prosperity. Tim Martin, awesome episode as usual. Thank you so much, Tim. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you learned something. I hope it fired you up a little bit to do something different than choosing Team A versus Team B and putting money towards one side or the other. I'm assuming most of you watching this show or listening to it, probably that is not your main strategy, but this is something I think we need to lead by example and show people that we can be effective as. That's why we publish our annual State of the Nullification Movement report at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. Please download and read it. It's free, 108 pages, lots of really great stuff. You can share that with everyone possible. Again, thank you so much for being here. If you support the show, please consider a membership. They start out as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'm so very grateful for those of you who I see out here and those who aren't even listening today. I'm so very grateful for those of you putting your financial faith behind our work. There's no way we could get the job done without your help. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope your Monday is off to a good start, and I'll see you on Wednesday here on the Path to Liberty.